The 28th of March, 1942. For 17 hours. Pas-de-Calais coast, occupied France. A thin blade of pre-dawn light hung over the channel, barely strong enough to cut through the cold mist sliding inland. Inside the concrete belly of a German Freya radar station perched above the dunes, a low electric hum vibrated against the walls. Oscilloscopes pulsed with green phantom lines. The air carried the sterile smell of hot vacuum tubes and damp wool uniforms. Every sound was magnified in the cramped room, the metallic tick of a wristwatch, the faint buzz of the rotating antenna above, the soft scrape of boots on concrete. The war felt close here, closer than anywhere else in northern France. Obergefreiter Leonard Voss stood rigid beside the plotting table, his eyes hovering over the radar sweep. He had spent months staring at the same slow arc, listening for the same heartbeat-like pulses that warned of incoming RAF formations. Most nights delivered nothing but wind and false echoes. This morning felt different. There was a weight in the air, an electrical heaviness he couldn't explain. Outside, the channel lay quiet, but quietness meant nothing. Silence had fooled them before. At 4:19, a subtle distortion rippled across the Freya screen, a quiver, small enough to dismiss as weather clutter, yet sharp enough to hold suspicion. Voss leaned in, adjusting the gain knob with practiced precision. The distortion vanished, then returned a second later, slightly stronger. Something was moving out there, hugging the surface of the sea where radar struggled to see. Above the bunker, wind pressed against the coastal cliffs, carrying the faint smell of salt and wet earth. Each gust caused the radar mast to squeal through its rotation. Inside, Unteroffizier Gerhard Keller monitored the secondary Wurzburg set, its parabolic dish tuned to catch higher altitude intruders. Tonight it showed nothing but empty air. Keller exhaled slowly, but the sense of tension creeping over the room refused to fade. Along the French coastline, Luftwaffe airfields lay vulnerable in the half-light, rows of Heinkel and Messerschmitt aircraft lined up on hardstands, fuel bowsers frozen in place, crews still half asleep in barracks. For months, the RAF had sent small circus raids to draw fighters into battle. But this morning had no sign of heavy bombers. No large contacts. No altitude. Only a faint, flickering echo skimming the sea. Far out over the channel, just meters above the waves, 12 Spitfire MKVBS advanced in a silent, predatory line. Their engines throbbed in synchronized low-frequency resonance, almost drowned by the roar of air splitting around their wingtips. The pilots held formation with razor discipline, shadows in their cockpits, hands firm on throttles vibrating with power. The mission relied on precision and darkness. Below 50 feet, they were invisible to Freya. They could see the reflections of their own propeller arcs shimmering on the water beneath them. The lead pilot checked his altimeter, barely registering above zero. The channel wind clawed at the planes, threatening to push them higher, but the formation remained locked in place, flying inside a narrow funnel of survivability. Too low, and they risked hitting waves. Too high, and German radar would catch them instantly. Every second stretched into a taut wire. At the Freya station, Voss detected a sharper pulse. A faint peak. He lowered the range scale. The echo slid toward the coastline with unnatural speed. This was no storm interference. The pulse repetition showed a rapid, consistent movement, something aggressive, controlled. He called for Keller to check the Wurzburg again. The dish swung on its motorized mount, whining as it searched the sky. Nothing. Keller felt the tension tighten. Low-flying aircraft could hide inside the radar's blind cone, sneaking beneath the detection horizon. It was rare, but the RAF had attempted it before. He tapped the side of his headset, listening for confirmation from coastal observers, but no reports had come in. The radar room swallowed the silence, amplifying the unease. The Spitfires crossed the halfway mark to France. Dawn light began forming a pale smear behind them, turning the canopy glass to cold silver. Thin wisps of mist curled off the water as the formation cut through the shifting air. The coastline ahead appeared as a dark silhouette rising from the sea, cliffs, dunes, scattered bunkers. Anti-aircraft positions remained quiet, unaware of what approached beneath them like predators drifting under a sleeping guard. Voss increased the gain again. The echo grew into a trembling crescent near the outer ring of the sweep. His pulse quickened. Low-level tracks moved differently from normal bomber raids, faster, thinner, more erratic. He steadied his breath, attempting to isolate individual returns, but the Freya struggled to resolve anything this low. They were dealing with shadows, and shadows moved unpredictably. The Spitfires tightened formation as they neared the coast. Terrain masking was about to become their shield. Once they crossed the cliffs, they'd drop into valleys and hedgerows, weaving through the early morning darkness. For now, they stayed over water, the most dangerous stretch of the mission, the moment when German operators could still catch a hint of them if conditions allowed. At 4:26, Voss saw the distortion spike. This was real. He flagged the nearest controller, who stepped into the room, expression shifting as he studied the screen. The faint echoes slid toward the coast like ghosts running beneath the radar's gaze. If these were fighters, they were not climbing. If they were bombers, they were microscopic. Nothing made sense. Then the return blinked out, vanished just as it reached the edge of the detection zone. Not fading. Disappearing. The controller froze. Keller stared at the blank Wurzburg screen, unease crawling up his spine. At that exact moment, 12 Spitfires knifed beneath the cliffs and vanished from German radar entirely, slipping into the folds of occupied France like blades drawn into shadows. The Freya room fell still, the operators unaware that the danger had already crossed their threshold, low and silent, invisible and closing fast on the first Luftwaffe airfield still asleep under the thinning night. The first faint glow of dawn was barely a smear across the horizon when the Spitfires swept inland. Shadows stretched across the fields, hedgerows, and scattered farmhouses. Engines hummed in perfect synchronization, a mechanical whisper against the heavy, damp air. Each pilot's eyes scanned the terrain for obstacles, trees, telephone poles, fences, all potential killers at 70 feet. The channel had been their ally. Now the land demanded precision. Every second mattered. Below them, the airfield at St. Omer yawned in pre-dawn stillness. Hangars loomed like iron tombs, their roofs glinting faintly in the first silver light. Rows of Messerschmitts and Heinkels lay idle on concrete pads. Fuel trucks and maintenance carts rested where they had been left overnight. Small groups of ground crew moved sluggishly between planes, unaware of the predators slicing the mist overhead. The low hum of engines and the faint wind carried no warning. Inside the radar station 20 kilometers away, Voss and Keller tried to reconcile the sudden absence of returns. Their instruments had failed to detect anything that low. A cursory glance at the frequency spectrum showed only scattered static. The operators shifted uneasily, each aware that something had penetrated their defenses. The Freya system was formidable, but it had limits, and tonight, those limits were about to be exposed. The Spitfires adjusted formation, one wing sliding slightly to the right to align with the approach corridor. They descended further into valleys, the terrain swallowing their silhouettes. Frosted hedgerows and muddy paths raced beneath them, the sensation of speed multiplied by proximity. In the cockpits, vibrations coursed through their hands, metal and oil feeding tension into every sinew. The pilots were ghosts, breathing shallow, attuned to the rhythm of their machines, to the resonance of low-level air, to the faint sounds that betrayed movement ahead. At the airfield, the first sound of activity began, the hiss of a fuel pump, a door clanging in the wind, a distant cough of a sentry rousing from a bunk. None lasted long. In a single, coordinated sweep, the Spitfires sliced into position, leveling guns, calculating angles of attack with precise instinct honed in months of practice. Their approach was almost invisible. The hum of engines blended with the wind, the thin smell of oil and metal drifting over hedgerows. The first bursts of cannon fire cracked through the silence. Concrete pads shattered under concentrated 20mm rounds. Messerschmitts erupted in a staccato of flame and metal, twisted into grotesque angles. Fuel trucks ignited in twin columns of orange fire, the smoke curling in slow, heavy spirals. The Spitfires banked low, each wingtip a breath above the ground, every movement deliberate, violent, controlled. The soundscape was chaos, metal groaning, fire snapping, distant explosions bouncing off hangars, a single engine whistle cutting through the mayhem. Back at the radar station, the Freya operators began to register irregularities. At first, it was a flicker, barely perceptible, almost too fast to analyze. Then multiple spikes traced across the scope in erratic, low-altitude arcs. Voss realized the readings didn't match any known aircraft profile. The dots moved too fast, too erratically, hugging terrain in impossible ways. His fingers trembled slightly on the controls as he tried to triangulate. Keller adjusted the Wurzburg dish frantically, but the system could not resolve the altitude. Subsonic, below horizon, Voss muttered under his breath. The word barely escaped him before another set of echoes blinked out entirely. The Spitfires had already struck multiple targets. Hangars were hollowed shells, aircraft reduced to flaming debris. Explosions reverberated across the airfield, the heat rising in turbulent currents, warping the morning mist into violent swirls. Crewmen dived into ditches, screaming, their silhouettes cut into the firelight, human shadows dancing against steel and flame. The pilots maintained formation, executing split-second maneuvers to avoid debris, banking hard to line up secondary targets. Every second was a calculated risk. The proximity to the ground and the unpredictability of collapsing structures made a mistake fatal. One Spitfire clipped a fuel line, sending a geyser of flaming gasoline arcing toward another plane. Quick reflexes kept the formation intact, but a burst of acrid smoke washed over the pilots' faces, stinging eyes and throat. Each plane was a vessel of tension, the slightest error magnified into catastrophe. In this low-level nightmare, the Spitfires were a single organism, each pilot aware of the others through instinct and training alone. Keller's hands ached from twisting dials and tapping buttons in futile attempts to locate the intruders. Static filled the room, punctuated by the distant rumble of anti-aircraft fire finally awakening from slumber. Flak cannons spat shells into the air, but the projectiles arched too high, detonating harmlessly above the predators. Radar returns flickered, revealing nothing but gaps and ghost echoes. The German crews understood, too late, that these intruders were exploiting every weakness in their system. The Spitfires withdrew briefly, circling around the airfield at treetop height, assessing damage and lining up a secondary pass. Smoke coiled like serpents over hangars, and the scent of burning fuel carried over the low fields. Engines vibrated through the air, the high-pitched whine of superchargers slicing through the mist. For the pilots, adrenaline and focus fused into a singular clarity. Hesitation meant death. Every shadow, every hedge, every angle of light could hide a threat. Yet nothing materialized. The airfield was theirs in these moments, chaos reigning over German order. Back in the radar room, Voss stared at the blank screens, heart hammering. The Freya system was supposed to detect every aircraft in the sector. Every rule, every procedure he knew had failed. He tapped the metal table, the echo bouncing through the bunker like a gunshot. Keller's jaw was tight. The silence was suffocating. Outside, distant flares lit the horizon, the fires of the airfield, and even from 20 kilometers away, the operators could feel the heat in their lungs. The war was unfolding before them, unstoppable and invisible. The Spitfires banked low once more, engines whining in a metallic crescendo, disappearing back toward the channel like shadows retreating into dawn. Their presence had been brief, surgical, devastating. But in every heartbeat of the radar crew, the realization struck: they had witnessed a new kind of warfare, one that could not be reliably predicted, measured, or stopped. The calm of the morning hid the destruction, yet the echoes of it would linger in German minds for hours. The operators finally exhaled, but the tension remained thick, the pulse of the radar mast whining through the bunker. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying smoke and the scent of destruction inland. Somewhere, far below, men counted losses. Machines lay twisted. And the intruders were gone. Invisible. Untouchable. The Spitfires were back over the channel, their silhouettes streaking against the rising sun like silver arrows. Engines screamed in a synchronized howl, the metal vibrating through every bone in the cockpit. Even brief silence was temporary, as the wind ripped past the wings and the low hum of the supercharger never ceased. Yet no relief came from the mission's danger. The Luftwaffe had begun mobilizing, flak firing in arcs over distant fields, searchlights cutting through the mist, probing for shapes too elusive to catch. The lead pilot banked sharply, the tip of his wing slicing just meters from a cliff face. Below, rolling waves clashed against jagged rocks, hissing and spitting white spray into the air. The formation tightened, instinct dictating every movement. There was no room for error. Even a single miscalculation would mean plunging into the channel or the jagged French coastline. The men felt the cold, the spray, the vibrations of engines and turbulence, their senses amplified beyond normal human capacity. Below, German radar stations scrambled. Voss and Keller frantically rescanned the horizon. Sporadic echoes appeared, flickering like fleeting shadows, moving at impossible speeds. They called for the anti-aircraft batteries to prepare, but the low-altitude approach prevented most guns from achieving correct firing angles. Shells erupted overhead in brief, violent bursts, plumes of smoke trailing jagged arcs across the sky. Each explosion sent a shockwave through the cockpit of the Spitfires, felt more than heard, rattling instruments and forcing pilots to bank or dive in millisecond decisions. The second airfield, Bethune, came into view. Hangars lined the perimeter like steel sarcophagi, aircraft parked nose to nose, engines cold, personnel dispersed in early morning routines. The Spitfires descended into valleys and hedgerows again, a wave of shadow cutting through dim light. Prop wash stirred dust and debris from farm paths, whipping into miniature tornadoes. The smell of wet earth and gasoline filled the cockpits. Every visual cue mattered: the angle of a hangar door, the glint of sunlight on a canopy, the flutter of canvas over a fuel cart. The first Spitfire opened fire. The report of 20mm cannons tore through the silence, metal cracking against thin aluminum. Flames erupted across a Heinkel, its wings folding inward as fuel ignited. A second Spitfire followed, cutting through a line of parked Messerschmitts, shredding them into burning wrecks. Explosions resonated across the landscape, each shockwave a reminder of the extreme proximity. The pilots could feel the heat from their targets even from 100 feet above. Smoke coiled in thick spirals, drifting along the terrain, mixing with the mist and forming a ghostly haze. Anti-aircraft crews finally responded, but the Spitfire's low-level approach rendered most of their shells useless. Flak arced high above, detonating in fiery bursts, sending shrapnel raining harmlessly past the aircraft. Still, the risk was constant. One misjudged maneuver would send a plane into a tree, a ditch, or a blast of its own ammunition. The pilots moved as one organism, wings brushing the tops of hedges, noses dipping toward ditches, eyes scanning, calculating, feeling each gust, each ripple of air. In one cockpit, the lead pilot saw a sudden flare of fire from a fuel truck. The explosion knocked him sideways, the G-forces snapping his head against the headrest. He corrected instantly, eyes scanning for debris, wings trembling under strain. Nearby, a wingman narrowly avoided the splintered remains of a burning hangar roof, his Spitfire grazing the mud, shaking violently. The sound of twisting metal, snapping wood, and distant gunfire mixed into a deafening sensory overload. Inside the radar station, Voss realized the intruders had reached their second target. The Freya pulses flickered erratically, the system failing to resolve low-level movement. His hands shook as he twisted knobs, trying to bring clarity, but all he saw were shadows. Keller adjusted the Wurzburg dish, chasing intermittent blips, each one fading before they could lock on. The operators felt helpless. Every protocol, every calculation, every expectation had been nullified. The enemy was inside their perimeter, invisible and lethal. The Spitfires moved to their third target, a maintenance depot with fuel storage and repair shops. Their timing was synchronized with precision. Any delay would risk interception by scrambling fighters. Propellers churned the humid air, whipping the smoke from previous explosions into a dense, choking haze. Visibility dropped. Engines roared against the low clouds of smoke. The pilots relied on instincts, memory, and every ounce of training to keep formation. A secondary wave of flak fired closer this time. Shards of metal cut the air, striking the ground mere meters from the planes. One pilot's canopy was scored with a jagged scratch, the glass vibrating as if alive. Another saw a shell detonate dangerously close, pressure pushing against the fuselage, the vibration rattling controls. Each explosion threatened to disrupt their rhythm, but none broke it. The pilots were suspended in a delicate balance of precision and chaos, acutely aware that every split-second decision could be fatal. As the Spitfires exited the depot, wings coated in smoke and heat, a distant roar signaled the approach of Luftwaffe fighters. Messerschmitt 109 streaked across the sky, silhouetted against the rising sun. The Spitfires had no time to climb for advantage. They continued low, weaving through valleys and tree lines, exploiting shadows. Cannon fire spat from enemy guns, ricocheting off trees and concrete, yet the low-level attack allowed the intruders to remain largely untouchable. By the time the Spitfires returned toward the channel, the devastation they left behind was complete. Hangars burned, fuel depots erupted in columns of flame, aircraft twisted and molten. Fires reflected off wet fields and hedgerows, painting the terrain in shades of orange and black. Every pilot felt the raw weight of survival, the silence between bursts of flak now filled with the heavy hum of engines and the taste of adrenaline in their mouths. In the radar station, the operators finally processed the reality. The intruders had penetrated defenses, destroyed key targets, and vanished without trace. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the Freya and Wurzburg systems. Voss rested his head on the cold metal table, the echo of explosions and chaos haunting his mind. Keller's hands trembled as he wiped sweat and grime from his brow. Outside, the fires from the airfields rose like torches in the mist, visible even from 20 kilometers away. The Spitfires streaked across the channel, shadows slipping back into the water and mist from which they had come. Engines hummed, vibrations lulling the pilots into tense awareness. They had survived, yet the tension remained, the knowledge that the next sortie could be their last etched into every heartbeat. The morning sky opened before them, pale and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. Yet beneath that calm, a war had shifted, and a new fear had taken root inside the minds of those who had glimpsed it. The fires at Saint-Omer and Bethune still smouldered when the first light of day broke fully across northern France. Smoke curled into the sky like ink in water, drifting across fields and villages, a black reminder of what had passed in the pre-dawn hours. From the air, the devastation appeared almost abstract: twisted metal, blackened hangars, shattered fuel tanks, and scarred concrete. From the ground, it was chaos, smouldering debris, scattered equipment, and men crawling from ditches, coughing, shaking, terrified by destruction they had no time to counter. Inside the radar station, Voss and Keller sat frozen behind consoles that no longer offered answers. The Freya scope had gone silent, the Wurzburg dish spun in empty arcs. Every protocol, every procedure, every calculation had failed against the low-flying predators. In the cold metal bunker, sweat ran in rivulets down faces etched with exhaustion, disbelief, and fear. For the first time, they understood that the war had evolved faster than their defenses. The enemy had adapted, exploiting gaps invisible to even the most meticulous observation. At Luftwaffe command posts across the Pas-de-Calais, officers pored over reports and photographs of the destruction. Fuel depots, hangars, and aircraft lost to the RAF strikes. Pilots, mechanics, and ground crew unprepared, casualties mounting. The scale of the operation was unsettling, the precision surgical, the audacity staggering. Questions swirled among commanders. How could aircraft penetrate radar coverage so thoroughly, strike with such accuracy, and vanish without pursuit? How could the RAF know their blind spots so intimately? For the RAF pilots, the return flight across the Channel was tense but methodical. Engines hummed with the faint resonance of adrenaline and relief. Each man scanned the skies, alert to sudden silhouettes or glinting reflections of enemy fighters. The Channel stretched beneath them, its waters indifferent to the violence above and beyond. Every wave glinting in the early morning sun was a reminder of the razor-thin margin between survival and catastrophe. Exhaustion settled in, but so did a grim satisfaction. The mission had succeeded, precisely as planned. Debriefings at RAF airfields later that morning were clinical but intense. Pilots spoke in clipped terms, reviewing altitudes, timings, and damage assessments. Maps were traced with fingers, each target verified. Reports noted the exceptional success of terrain-hugging tactics, the efficiency of low-level approaches, and the lethal combination of speed, surprise, and precision. Every man was aware that such raids could not be repeated without risk. The element of invisibility was fragile, dependent on dawn light, weather, and discipline. Yet the psychological impact was undeniable. The Luftwaffe, once confident in their radar superiority, had been exposed. A new edge had been won, invisible and brutal. Across northern France, Luftwaffe crews faced a sobering reality. Radar networks, once their sentinel, were incomplete, fallible. The notion of security had been shattered in minutes by aircraft so low, so disciplined, they defied detection. Officers traced lines across maps, recalculating coverage, shifting batteries, revising procedures. Fear had entered the calculations. The next time, they told themselves, it would be different, but deep down, they knew these attacks could recur, and they would never be completely predictable. The civilians nearby awoke to the scent of smoke, the sound of twisted metal settling, and the distant wail of sirens. Fields were scarred, farm buildings damaged, and supply lines disrupted. For those who lived under occupation, it was an abstract terror, the violence they could not see arriving and disappearing in the mist before anyone could intervene. The war had reached into their lives with a precision that left no room for preparation or resistance. Weeks later, the Luftwaffe revised radar protocols and began implementing countermeasures for low-level intrusions. Spotters were positioned along cliffs and valleys, anti-aircraft batteries were reoriented, dispersal of aircraft was mandated. Yet the RAF had demonstrated a capability that could never be fully negated. Precision, low-level strikes executed with perfect timing, exploiting every blind spot. Every radar crew, every commander, carried the memory of the morning when Spitfires had penetrated defenses and left destruction behind without a trace. For the pilots, the raid was a quiet victory, a mission logged in black ink and steel, remembered in tense smiles and the faint shiver that never left after survival at the edge of destruction. They understood their advantage was fleeting, any complacency would be fatal. Still, there was pride in their craft, in the precision of planning, in the audacity to strike beneath radar eyes and leave devastation in their wake. In the cold dawn that followed, across both sides of the Channel, the war's machinery ground on. Fires smouldered, reports were written, procedures revised, and calculations redrawn. But the memory of that early morning, when shadows moved like knives across airfields, when engines roared low over the land and vanished like smoke in the wind, lingered in every mind. It was a lesson written in fire and metal, in the smell of smoke and the hum of a radar pulse, that even the most vigilant eyes could fail, and that the invisible, disciplined hand of the Spitfire was capable of rewriting the battlefield in minutes. And somewhere above the channel, long after the echoes of guns and engines had faded, a line of silver aircraft cut across the morning sky, their shadows slipping silently over waves and fields, leaving a quiet, lingering question in the minds of all who watched too late. How do you fight what you cannot see?